Lost in the Pacific, 1942, by Todd Olson. These were the castaways, the men that were in that plane when it went down. Colonel Eddie Rickenbacker, he was the VIP, very important person. Colonel Hans Adamson, the VIP's escort. Captain Bill Cherry, the pilot, very important person, the pilot. Lieutenant Jim Whitaker, the co-pilot. Lieutenant John DeAngelis, the navigator. The radio man was Sergeant James Reynolds. Sergeant Alex, I'm going to say K because I don't want to mess up, the engineer, and Private Johnny Bartek, the other engineer. Prologue, October 21st, 1942, somewhere over the South Pacific. The Pacific Ocean looked calm and inviting from 5,000 feet up, with the drone of 4 sturdy motors in Jim Whitaker's ears, but he had no desire to land a 15-ton, 4-engine plane down there. To a B-17 bomber plunging from the sky, the ocean is as unforgiving as a concrete wall. Yet by 1:30 p.m. on October 21st, 1942, that was the only option left. Whitaker was the B-17's co-pilot. He and the rest of the crew were ferrying a VIP passenger on a top-secret mission deep into the war zone. They had completely missed Canton Island, the tiny speck in the great blue, where they were supposed to refuel. Now they were fighting in a giant square pattern, flying in a giant square pattern, hoping to spot land. They took turns staring out the window at the ocean below, mistaking cloud shadows for islands. Island eyes, the airmen called it, the surest sign that desperation had set in. The fact was they were lost, somewhere in the middle of the Pacific. They were nearly out of fuel, and the only landing strip they had was a vast tarmac of water. No one knew exactly how they had lost their way. Maybe the tailwinds were stronger than the weathermen had predicted. Maybe the compass had taken a hit when they nearly crashed taking off in Hawaii. Either way, the navigator had finally given up trying to figure out where they were. He was a young guy named John DeAngelis who had gotten married just 2 days before they were called away. Now he was probably wondering if he would ever see his wife again. "Do you fellows mind if I pray?" he shouted to the crew over the roar of the engines. Pray, Whitaker thought. How about keeping your mind on the task at hand? Surviving an impact with the Pacific Ocean? Whitaker decided not to say a word. DeAngelis could swan dive into the ocean, and it wouldn't matter. Their lives were in Bill Cherry's hands now, the 27-year-old pilot from Texas who sat next to Whitaker with the controls in his hands. Cherry and Whitaker began to talk strategy. It had been 10.5 months since the United States was drawn into World War II. In that time, plenty of bomber crews had ditched in the Pacific. Not one, as far as they could remember, had escaped without casualties. If the surface of the ocean were flat, it would be one thing, but today the water rose and fell in treacherous swells. If you came in across the current, you would have to time it exactly right. Scrape the crest of a swell, and the nose would dip, sending the plane plummeting into the depths. Avoid one crest, and you could ram the plane into the next one, shattering the entire craft into pieces in an instant. There was only one way to do it. Whitaker and Cherry agreed. Come in parallel to the swells and set the plane down in a trough. That, of course, was easier said than done. The troughs were a moving target, and the wind blew across your flight path, making it hard to hold a line. Hitting a landing spot just right would still take perfect timing, expert piloting skills, and a whole lot of luck. While Cherry and Whitaker worked out a strategy, their top secret passenger took charge of the crew behind them. And if luck really had anything to do with their fate, maybe he would trip the scales in their favor. He wasn't some desk-bound politician or stuffy diplomat. The VIP on board was none other than Eddie Rickenbacker. For anyone who cared about flying, and for most everyone else, that was all the introduction he needed. Aside from Charles Lindbergh, he was the world's most famous pilot. He hadn't flown in combat since 1918, when World War I ended, but to millions of Americans, his heroics against the Germans were unforgettable. He had shot down more enemy aircraft than any other American pilot. The ace Rickenbacker in France near the end of World War I. That was his picture standing with his plane. Now Rickenbacker was a businessman, president of Eastern Airlines, but he had a well-known reputation for surviving close scrapes. He had first become famous as an auto racer, driving primitive cars at speeds. As a fighter pilot, he nearly had his plane shredded by German bullets several times. Then, in the spring of 1941, he had been a passenger on one of his own airlines when it crashed into a Georgia forest. Trapped in the wreckage, he managed to direct rescue efforts with broken ribs, a shattered elbow, a fractured skull, and an eyeball torn loose from its socket. He was in such bad shape that the famous radio commentator Walter Winchell reported his death on the air. When Rickenbacker heard it from his hospital bed, he picked up a water pitcher and threw it at the radio. A year and a half later, Rickenbacker still looked frail from the crash and walked with a cane, but now, with another crash looming, he seemed determined to survive one more time. Rickenbacker grabbed the young Sergeant Alex Kay and pried open the bottom hatch in the B-17's tail. Then he and Kay lightened the plane's load to save fuel and lessen the impact when they went down. Out went the cots, toolkit, blankets, empty thermos bottles, and luggage. Sacks full of high priority mail sailed into the wind, soon to be a soggy, unreadable mess of good wishes that would never make it to the soldiers on the front lines. Cherry announced he was starting his descent, and the water outside Whitaker's window looked more distinct by the second. Back in the radio compartment, the men piled essential provisions by the hatch, a few bottles filled with water and coffee, emergency rations in a small metal box, a two-man raft rolled into a tight package. Once they landed, they might have as little as 30 seconds to get out before the plane went under, assuming they were still alive. The men stacked mattresses in position, padding the aft or rear side of the walls that separated the compartments of the plane. They all took their positions. Three men, Kay, DeAngelis, and Rickenbacker's military escort, Colonel Hans Adamson, lay on the floor, braced against the mattresses. Rickenbacker sat near them, belted into a seat near a window. Johnny Bartek, the engineer, sat just behind the cockpit. The plane had two inflatable rafts packed into compartments on the outside of the nose. It would be Bartek's job to release them just after they ditched. James Reynolds, the radio operator who went by Jim, sat by at his desk in the center of the plane. He tapped out SOS after SOS, hoping that someone out there would register their location before they hit the water. There was nothing but silence from the other end. "How much longer?" someone asked. "Not yet," Rickenbacker answered, peering out the window. In the cockpit, the altimeter showed they were 500 feet above the sea. Cherry cut two of the engines to save fuel. Whitaker grabbed cushions from the seats behind them and stuffed them under their safety harnesses. "It's sure been swell knowing you, Bill," he said, offering his hand. Cherry gripped his co-pilot's hand for a second and then said in his Texas drawl, "You're going to know me a long time yet, Jim." In the back, someone asked again, "How much longer?" 50 feet, said Rickenbacker. Then right away, 30 feet. Cherry was staring into the waves, trying to pick a trough to aim for. The swells looked towering, twice the height of a man. 20 feet. They were coming in at 90 miles an hour, but to Whitaker the plane seemed strangely still, the roar of the engines muffled, the whoosh of the wind against the fuselage fainter than it should have been. And then there was the radio whining its lonely signal into the sky. 10 feet! Bartek reached above them and loosened a set of bolts. The wind snatched the door of the cockpit escape hatch and sent it hurling into the sea. A rush of air howled through the opening. Cut it! Yelled Cherry. Whitaker pulled a switch and all electrical power on the plane went dead. Cherry pulled back hard on the wheel, lifting the nose and ramming the tail into the water. Back in the radio compartment, the noise was deafening. Pieces of equipment that had been bolted down a moment ago flew through the cabin like shrapnel from a bomb, and then the belly of the plane hit the water. Whitaker exploded forward, and the safety belt tried to slice him in half. Pressure filled his head. His eyes strained against their sockets. He couldn't see a thing. He began to lose consciousness. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the pressure released. The belt went slack against his chest. His vision returned. They had gone from 90 miles an hour to a dead stop in less than 50 feet. He couldn't be sure who survived and who had not. The Pacific Ocean was pouring fast into the plane, and no one in the big broad world knew where they were. Wow, that was a good chapter. I apologize for some of my mistakes, and if you heard a bell ringing in the back, that was Rosie to go out. And these are the kind of things when we try to work at home. We have all these things happening. So, we all make mistakes, and you do the best you can. I hope you enjoyed that chapter. I enjoyed reading it to you. I'm going to refer you now to the questions, and I hope you enjoyed that chapter.